What would you do if your own son, the child you raised with your own flesh, blood and tears, dragged you to court just because you could not pay for his wedding? This was not a fight. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a real lawsuit with full signatures, attorneys, and a legal ruling. I am a 75-year-old mother. I once sold my wedding ring to help my son pay rent. I went hungry so he could have a hot meal to take to school. And now, I was treated like a traitor, like a walking wallet. And do you know what hurt the most? It was when he stood in front of me in that courtroom. No eye contact, no remorse. If you think this is going to be a heartwarming family story, I am sorry. You will be disappointed. But if you stay until the very end, I promise you, you will witness a transformation, one of humiliation to awakening, from loss to justice, a journey for anyone who has ever been used, betrayed, and still found the courage to stand tall again. So hit that subscribe button if you believe that some stories deserve to be heard. And if you have ever been left behind by someone you love, leave a comment. I want to hear your voice. My name is Eleanor Grace Walker. I was born in 1949 in a small town not far from Nashville, where the sound of roosters in the morning was louder than traffic. I got married at 19. Hank, my husband, was an honest, kind-hearted construction worker, the only man who ever looked at me like I was his entire sky. We had one son, David. 3 years after David was born, Hank died in a scaffolding accident. They said he died instantly, but in my heart he lived on, in David's eyes, and in every breath I took to raise our son. From that moment on, I carried everything on my own. By day, I mopped other people's floors. By night, I served tables at a roadside diner. I had no weekends, no Thanksgivings, no Christmas. I had one goal: to give David a life where he would never have to live like I did. I remember one year, David had a high fever on the same night I picked up an extra shift. I carried him to the diner, laid him down under the prep counter, and covered him with my oldest coat. Every chance I had, I would bend down to touch his forehead, to check if the fever was breaking. No one knew. No one needed to. But I remember it, like it happened yesterday. David grew up with very little money, but I did everything I could to make sure he never felt poor. I hand-sewed his clothes. I learned how to cook cheap meals that were still nutritious. I hid myself beneath plain clothes, but I never let him go without love. He was a smart boy, gentle and curious. When his teachers praised him, I felt like every sacrifice I had made had been worth it. The day David was accepted into the University of Georgia with a full scholarship, I cried for 3 days, not out of sadness, but because I knew, at last, my son would not have to live the same life I had. That summer, I worked extra jobs to buy him a new suitcase and a good pair of sneakers. For the first time in my life, I bought something I would not wear or eat, and it still felt more valuable than gold. I sent him off on a foggy morning. I waved until I could not see the bus anymore. I thought everything had changed. I thought I had done it, but some life lessons only arrive too late. After graduation, David became someone I barely recognized. The sweet, gentle boy I raised grew cold and distant. He landed a job at a tech company in the heart of Atlanta, a place where people wore suits to cover the cracks in their souls. And there, he met Vanessa. She was beautiful, like a statue. Tall, sleek black hair, flawless makeup, and a voice smooth as syrup. But her eyes were always ice cold. So cold, I could tell she had never truly cared about anyone but herself. The first time I met Vanessa was at a dinner David hosted. I brought a homemade apple pie, David's favorite when he was little. Vanessa smiled politely, then set the pie aside without even touching it. Her eyes glanced down at my worn-out shoes, and she said, "Do you want me to take you shopping for new shoes?" Like she was doing charity work. I laughed it off, like I always did. That is how I survived life, swallowing my feelings and wearing politeness like armor. But after that meal, I knew something invisible had formed between me and my son. A wall. He stopped calling as often, then only called when he needed help. A down payment for a car, paying off a credit card from a bad investment. I never asked questions. I always thought, if I don't help him, who will? I sold the armchair Hank used to sit in while reading the paper, the last piece of our life together. I sent David the money without complaint. Then one day, David called and said he was engaged. He did not ask how I felt. He did not ask if I wanted to help plan the wedding. He just said, "Mom, you are going to help pay for the wedding, right? That is tradition." I paused, not because of the request, but because of how casually he said it. Like it was just my duty. I asked, "David, how much do you need?" He said, "About $15,000 should do it." I let out a bitter laugh. After nearly 50 years of working, I had a little over $3,000 saved. And now I was being asked to wipe it all away. For a day I had no say in, no voice in, and no guarantee I would even be invited to speak. I told him, "I cannot." That sentence was like a knife. David went quiet for a few seconds. Then he spoke, flat and mechanical, like reading from a script. "You do not understand. This is not just about money. This is responsibility. You are the adult. You should understand." No one asked if I ever had my own dream wedding. No one asked if anyone had ever helped me. They just looked at my bank account and called it a family obligation. I hung up the phone, hollow inside. And from that moment, nothing was ever the same again. About a month after that fateful phone call, I found a thick yellow envelope sitting in my mailbox. It was not a wedding invitation. It was not an apology. It was a court summons. David and Vanessa had officially filed a lawsuit against me. I read the title over and over again. Lawsuit for breach of verbal agreement to fund wedding expenses. My hands trembled, not out of fear, but from pain. I had thought at worst he would be upset with me, stop calling, maybe act disappointed. But to drag his own mother into court? With attorneys? With legal paperwork? I sat in silence the entire afternoon in the same kitchen where I used to simmer chicken soup when he was sick, where I waited up for him after night classes. Every corner of the house pierced my heart. On the day of the hearing, I wore the old blue dress Hank once said was his favorite. I sat there, facing David. He never once looked at me, not even a glance. Vanessa sat beside him, her arm draped loosely around his shoulder like she was guarding some precious asset. Her parents were there too. They looked at me like I was a burden they had to endure. David's lawyer stood and began presenting the case, claiming I had made a verbal promise to pay a large portion of the wedding expenses, that I had disrupted the planning process, caused emotional distress, and inflicted financial damage. I stayed still. I did not cry. I did not argue. I just looked at my son, the man I once carried in my arms, once shielded from storms, once sold my wedding ring to help pay his debts. The little boy who used to cuddle a teddy bear in his sleep was gone. In front of me was a stranger, protected by the law, but with a heart that had turned to stone. I did not hire a lawyer. I stood up and said a few brief words. I am the biological mother of the plaintiff. I never signed any document promising financial support. I once said I would try, but when I realized I could not, I told him so. If that is considered a crime, then I accept it. The courtroom fell silent, but no one stood with me. After a few hours of deliberation, the judge ruled that I had to pay David and Vanessa $12,000. I did not have $12,000. I had only $3,218. I went home like someone who had just been buried alive. I sat down in the chair where Hank used to read the newspaper. I did not turn on the light. I did not eat dinner. I just sat there until morning. I had lost everything. My entire life savings, my dignity, and the most precious thing of all, my belief in the bond between a mother and her child. I remember it rained that day. A bitter cold rain that felt just like my heart. I stood on my front porch, staring out at the yard where David once ran around with his little red plastic car. Now it was covered in soggy dead leaves, cold and lifeless. Each raindrop felt like it was sinking me deeper into the cruel truth. I had lost my son, not to death, but to greed and ingratitude. I gathered the last of the keepsakes that still remained, a family photo of the three of us at a state park in the fall of 1995. A drawing David made for me on Mother's Day with messy handwriting that said, "Mom, you are my hero." I held them to my chest like I was hugging the last pieces of my memories, then carefully packed them in an old box and sealed it shut. The next day, I sold the wooden chairs Hank had built, the noisy old refrigerator, even the cracked wedding ring I had worn for decades. I emptied the last of my savings, just a few $1,000s, the final breath of a dream that had quietly died. With nothing left to hold me back, I walked away from the house that once was home, carrying only a single suitcase. I boarded a night bus and sat by the window, watching the streetlights blur by like the weary beat of a broken heart. No one asked where I was going. No one cared why an old woman was traveling alone in the middle of the night. For the first time in my life, I felt completely invisible. But in that invisibility, I began to feel something deeply real. A quiet question rose within me. Is my life truly over? Or is this just the beginning of something else? Something better, something more peaceful? I remember one night I was sitting in the common room of the nursing home. Everything there was old. Yellowed lights and flimsy plastic chairs. The television was playing some movie about a family that makes up in the end. Everyone laughed, everyone forgave. I broke down crying. No one noticed. I turned my face away. I started spending more time writing in a journal. I wrote about Hank, about the early years raising David alone, about the cold morning I walked him to school for the first time. I wrote as if each word was a walking stick, helping me get back on my feet after each fall. One afternoon, while sitting on the porch watching the sunset, an elderly man at the facility named George asked, "What do you keep writing, Eleanor?" I replied, "I'm writing my life story, so I don't forget that I once lived with kindness, even when I was treated cruelly." He nodded, then handed me an old fountain pen. He said, "Do not let anyone else write the last chapter of your life. You have to be the one holding the pen." I have kept that pen ever since. Some nights I could not sleep. I would sit alone in that same common room, watching dim lights cast shadows on the chipped tile floor. I would think about women like me, quiet, resilient, pouring their hearts into their children, only to one day become strangers in their own families. Eventually, I started writing not just for myself, but for all the ones who had never been heard. I wrote about the pain of being dismissed, about kindness taken for granted, about the sacredness of motherhood being traded for a few $1,000s and a lavish wedding. One day, a young nurse named Lily asked me, "Eleanor, are you not angry? You talk about your son with no bitterness in your voice." I smiled. "Sweetheart, anger is a flood. It sweeps everything away. But I want to be the water, gentle, steady, and choosing my own direction." And I chose to walk toward the light. I began submitting short stories to the Letters from Readers column in the local newspaper. A few got published. Every time I saw my name printed on paper, my heart fluttered, like a young girl being praised for the first time. Writing, for me, was no longer just a way to heal. It had become a declaration, a statement that I still existed, that I still had a voice, and that I did not need anyone to validate that I was a good mother. I knew that better than anyone else. Little by little, I began devoting my entire mornings to writing, not to complain, but to come alive again. I began recounting every moment of my life with absolute honesty, the joy and the wounds that had never quite closed. Writing made me feel as though I was stitching my soul back together, each word a quiet but steady thread. I remember one chilly afternoon, I opened a letter Hank had written while he was in the army. In it, he wrote, If one day you feel the world turning its back on you, just remember, I never did. I had read that letter 100 times, but that day it whispered something new to me. You still have yourself. You still deserve a beautiful life. And for the first time in months, I looked in the mirror and smiled. A small, trembling smile, but so honest it made me weep. From that moment on, I started reading poetry aloud to the other elders every Saturday night. Some cried, some laughed. And some simply held my hand as if to say, "You just spoke the words I have never had the courage to say. I used to believe that by the time you turned 75, you would have learned how to live peacefully with loss. But how can peace exist when the very person you loved the most was the one who delivered the final blow? Not with harsh words, but with pure, chilling indifference. Silence, I have learned, kills more than any scream ever could." There are nights when I dream of David at 4 years old, running up to hug my legs, calling out, "Mommy, Mommy!" I jolt awake, my arms wrapped tightly around the blanket, as if I am still holding on to a child who has vanished into thin air, and I cry. Not out of pain anymore, but because there is nothing left to hope for. I started writing everything down. No structure, no timeline. Just memories as they surfaced. The last breath Hank took in the hospital. The day David got a perfect score on his first spelling test. The tiny hand that clung to mine on his first day of kindergarten. I wrote so I would not forget. I wrote to remember that I once loved, once sacrificed, once gave everything I had to someone else. I wrote the things I had never dared to say out loud. The shame I felt borrowing money to pay for David's tuition. The fear of lying in the emergency room with no one by my side. And the moment I stood in front of a mirror, staring at a tired old woman I could barely recognize as myself. I wrote, then I tore the pages, then I wrote again. Each time I did, I felt a piece of the anger, a piece of the pain pulled out from my chest, like every word was drawing the poison out of my soul. One day, I sat in the courtyard of the nursing home, holding a lukewarm cup of tea, watching sparrows flutter across the maple trees. I quietly asked myself, if I could go back in time, would I have done anything differently? And the answer was, no. I would still love my son. I would still make sacrifices. But this time, I would also learn how to love myself. David had no idea I still owned a small plot of land from Hank's side of the family. Just under 2 acres, more than an hour's drive from the city. It was left to us by Hank's parents, the very place where he used to camp as a little boy. I had nearly forgotten it, until I received a letter from the Department of Transportation. They were planning to expand the nearby highway and offered to buy the land for $89,000. I held that offer in my hands, my heart pounding. I read every line, every word, as if holding on to a lifeline. I told no one. I did not call a lawyer. I asked for no advice. I simply signed. For the first time in years, I felt like I was holding the pen in the story of my own life. I withdrew $12,000 to pay the court-ordered damages to David. No letter, no message, just a check sent by mail with one short note. Your share, from Mom, Eleanor. The rest, I did something I never imagined I could. I gave it away. I donated nearly $70,000 to the nursing home that had taken me in when I had nowhere else to go. I asked that part of it be used to rebuild the tiny library and purchase new typewriters for the elderly residents who still loved to write. The remaining amount, I kept just enough to start over, to begin a life where no one knew my name, no one expected me to be someone's mother, no one greeted me with disappointment. I packed everything in a single morning. A few plain outfits, my journal, an old radio, and the fountain pen George had given me. I moved to a small town in northern Maine, where the lake water is clear as glass, and the morning mist is so thick it feels like it wraps around your entire body. I rented a rustic wooden cabin by the lake. No cell service, no social media, just nature, The breeze through the windows, the tapping of woodpeckers, and the scent of pine in every breath. For the first time in decades, I was no longer David's mother, no longer the defendant, no longer the victim. I was simply Eleanor, a woman with a living soul, still breathing, still writing the rest of her life. I brewed a cup of peppermint tea, opened a blank notebook, and wrote the first line. The day I disappeared from the old world was the day I finally began to live. I rented that cabin by the lake. Small, wooden, with a sagging roof, but to me, it was paradise. Each morning, I would brew tea, sit on the front step, and watch the fog slowly lift from the water. Squirrels leapt through the trees. Birds called across the forest. No car horns, no accusations, no one asking what I had done for them today. I began writing again, this time a novel. A story about a woman betrayed and abandoned, but who rises on her own pride and strength. I did not name the character after myself, but I knew, every sentence, every chapter, I was breathing through the page. I mailed the first manuscript to a small independent publisher in Vermont. I did not expect much. I just wanted to know if a life like mine was worth listening to. 2 months later, I received a handwritten letter, not an email. The editor wrote that they had read the whole thing in one night, and there were moments when they had to stop to cry. They wanted to publish my book. I cried, not out of pride, but because I finally reclaimed my voice. No courtroom needed, no revenge, just truth. I told no one my real name. The cover simply said, Author, E. Walker. But every letter from readers said the same thing. I saw myself in you, and you gave me hope. Maybe that is the only miracle I need in this final chapter of life. I put down David's letter, then I picked it up again. I read it 3 times. Each word felt like a blade against my heart, but this time no blood came. I was no longer the woman I used to be, the one who feared abandonment so much she kept reaching out to those who hurt her. No, I was now Eleanor, a woman who knew her worth and knew when to close a door that had rotted off its hinges. I did not write back right away. I walked to the lakeshore with my old leather notebook and pen. I sat beside the water, still as glass, and thought of David's eyes when he was a child. So bright, so clear, untouched by the world. Then I remembered his eyes in court. Cold, distant, unfamiliar. I understood. The boy I once knew no longer existed. I could still love the memories, but I would not let those memories shackle me to pain. I wrote the letter by hand, slowly, word by word. No anger, no blame. Just quiet, honest truth. A goodbye without tears. I mailed the letter without expecting a reply, not because I did not care, but because I had already let go. Then I made a cup of tea and sat down to reread the manuscript of my second book. This story was not about betrayal. It was about rebirth. A woman who learns to say no without guilt, who knows how to move forward without needing anyone's blessing. At last, I had become the kind of person I once hoped my son would grow up to be, resilient, honest, and living by her own values. One early winter morning, as I was raking red maple leaves around the cabin, I received a forwarded letter from my old nursing home. The handwriting in the corner was instantly familiar, slanted and rushed. It was David's. I opened it. The paper was thin, the ink smudged in places, as if water had soaked through it. In the letter, David said that Vanessa had left him. Not just left, she had taken all their shared savings, his wedding ring, and the credit cards in his name. The startup, where he had worked, had gone under after a massive round of layoffs. Now, he was living in his car, unable to afford rent, with no friends left to turn to. For the first time in years, David wrote a letter that did not drip with arrogance. He said he missed me. He said now he finally understood what it felt like to be abandoned, to be used, to be discarded. I am sorry I broke your heart, he wrote. I was blind, selfish, and stupid. If there is still a place for me in your heart, if you still consider me your son, would you let me stay with you for a while? I set the letter down, my heart as still as the lake beneath falling snow. Not because I felt joy, not because I felt vindicated, but because I knew this was a defining moment. Forgiveness is never easy, but forgiveness does not mean allowing someone to hurt you again. I was no longer the woman David once believed he could keep taking from forever. I understood something now. Not every fall needs a helping hand. Some falls are necessary, so we learn how to stand on our own. I wrote back, simple, gentle, but firm. David, I still love you. I will always love you. But real love does not come with blind endurance. I hope you overcome this hardship on your own 2 feet. I am no longer at my old address, and I am no longer in the same place in your life. Wishing you peace. Mom. I sealed the envelope, walked it to the town's post office, and walked away without looking back. On the way home, the wind kicked up in bursts. The last of the autumn leaves lifted into the sky, dancing, then slowly falling, like pieces of memory I was finally ready to let go of. I lifted my head, felt the chill breeze rush through my silver hair, but this time, I did not shiver. I felt light. That night, I lit the fireplace and sat alone in the flickering glow of orange flames. I opened my journal to a fresh page and wrote, I chose love, but not the kind that hurts. I no longer wrote for David. I wrote for myself, for the women who had been hurt but still believed in kindness. I wrote to remember that I had lived, I had suffered, I had risen, and I was still here. In the small town I now call home, people just know me as Quiet Miss Eleanor. They do not know my past. They only know I am the older lady who helps at the library, who brings cookies to the firehouse on weekends. One morning, a little girl, maybe 8 years old, came to me and handed me a crayon drawing. In it, I was sitting under a tree, writing. Above my head were the words, "You were the first person who ever listened to me." I cried, quietly. But this time, they were tears of joy. I no longer need apologies from the past, because I have found my answer in the present. It has been 5 years since the day I dropped that final letter into the postbox. No reply, no messages, no calls, no apologies, and no expectations left behind. I no longer count the days, I count the peace. Each morning, I brew a cup of peppermint tea and sit on the porch, watching the lake lie still, listening to the birds sing through the pine trees. I have learned to cherish silence, not the cold silence of being shut out, but the warm quiet of a soul that finally knows who it is. I now teach writing classes to the elderly in town. Some write about the war, others write about their first loves. A few simply jot down a sentence each morning, like a whisper to the past. We gather in a circle under the old library porch, the wind flipping through our pages, and the sound of laughter, awkward but sincere, echoes around us. I tell them what I have been through, not to seek pity, but to show them this. Even if you have been betrayed, even if you have lost everything, there is always a path back to yourself. I am no longer afraid of being alone. I am no longer afraid of being forgotten, because I know we are only truly forgotten when we stop telling our story. I am Eleanor. Not the victim, not the defendant, not the grieving mother. I am a woman who rose from the cold soil of betrayal and bloomed. I am living proof that kindness is not weakness, that forgiveness is not surrender, and that walking away, quiet as it may be, can echo louder than any scream. What about you? What would you do if the very person you poured your life into, someone you raised, loved, sacrificed for, turned their back on you and dragged you into court? Would you fight? Would you forgive? Or would you simply walk away? I do not have the right answer for everyone. All I have is the truth of my own story. And now, I would like to hear yours. share it in the comments below. Because maybe, just maybe, a stranger reading your words might recognize themselves in them. If this story made you cry, or sit in silence, or remember your own mother, or your own self, then please, do not leave in silence. Subscribe. Because this channel is not just a place for stories. It is a place for voices that once felt forgotten. A place for mothers, fathers, and elders who have been betrayed or silently endured for years, to finally feel seen and to know you are not alone. Thank you for staying with me all the way through. And please, remember this: you are not weak because you loved. You are strong because you survived love that failed you. You are not worthless because you were forgotten. You are priceless because you are still here, whole, alive, and worthy of being heard. And sometimes, justice does not come from a courtroom. It comes from a quiet cabin in the woods, from a journal entry written in the dark, from a burst of laughter when you finally dare to live, and from a community that welcomes you back home.